was sold a leadership lie. Not intentionally and not maliciously, but the lie was that to be an exceptional leader, you have to be charismatic, confident, composed. You have to be quick on your feet, verbally fluent, and make excellent eye contact. I believed that lie. And I spent my entire career trying to embody being that type of leader. I have always worked in safety, high consequence environments where mistakes matter and harm is real, where leadership is supposed to decrease risk, not increase it. So when I was invited to a leadership workshop at work, I was fizzing. I arrived exactly on time with a notebook, tons of highlighters, ready to absorb the secrets of what was going to make an exceptional leader. And as the facilitator clicked through the slides, confidence, charisma, adaptability, resilience, emotional intelligence, it read like a recipe. If you could master these traits, you could lead anyone. But even as I wrote the words down, a sense of unease came over me because at the time, my son was going through an autism assessment and he had different skills and traits. So does that mean leadership wasn't in his future? Leadership traditionally has only ever looked like one sort of person. So eventually I got the balls and I put my hand up in the workshop and I said, if leadership is defined by these particular strengths and traits, where does that lead people who communicate or think differently? Can they be leaders? The entire room went silent. Everybody looked at me awkwardly. And the facilitator looked at me like I'd asked something completely unrelated or that I'd grown like fins on my ears. And she said politely something along the lines of, well, people skills are essential to leadership. It was pretty matter of fact, and it wasn't rude. But it was in that moment that I realized, there would be many people in that room that had already disqualified themselves from leadership because they didn't see themselves in those traits. That indirectly or directly, someone had already told them that they weren't leadership material, or that they were too quirky, or they were too much, or too loud, or too something. They weren't the right cultural fit. I'm guessing the number in that room was far higher than we would ever like to admit. I didn't know at the time that I was autistic with ADHD. And up until that point, I had heard so many times the phrase, but aren't we all a little bit on the spectrum? And I realize that that comes from a place of good intention, to normalize difference. But in reality, it's factually inaccurate, and it is also very harmful. I don't disagree that there are days where people feel overwhelmed, overstimulated, maybe you can't focus, but it is not the same as having autism and ADHD. It is a neurodevelopmental difference, essentially a different operating system processing different information, not just occasional difficulty. We call neurodivergence kind of an umbrella term for cognitive differences like autism and ADHD. Neurodiversity, however, is the natural variation of how the human brain works. So we're going to lean into my autism for a moment, and it loves data, statistics, and evidence, and we're going to look a little bit of neuroscience. It's not rocket science, though. One to 2% of the population, according to the US CDC, have autism, where 5 to 7% of the population have ADHD. This is also supported by international research around age, demographics, and diagnostic criteria. Until 2013, autism and ADHD were actively discouraged from being diagnosed in the same person, and recent studies have kind of challenged that. In 2019, Lao Tzu found that of that 1 to 2% of people with autism, 30 to 50% of those people meet the criteria in the diagnostic manual to also be diagnosed with ADHD. That tells us that there is a lived experience called ADHD. It is a comorbidity. It is not a condition on its own. And let's be honest, it's a terrible name, so I'm taking name suggestions: Autism Prime, ADHD Pro Max, ADHD Plus Plus. I don't know, suggestion box is at the door, but not actually. But in all seriousness, this actually tells us two things. The first thing is, no, not everyone is a little on the spectrum. Two, statistically, we're already in your workplace. This is important because autism thrives on structure and routine and focus, where ADHD thrives on creativity and novelty and momentum. Neuroscientist Todd Rose tells us there's no such thing as an average brain, and human cognition varies. And if we design systems with that imagined average in mind, we're already excluding people. We see this even more in data from the UK Office of National Statistics and alongside research from Oscarson and also from Taurus that shows a consistent pattern. Autistic adults are significantly more under and unemployed in relation to their non-disabled peers, even when their qualifications, education, and technical skills are comparable. ADHD adults experience higher level of work-related anxiety and stress, and emotional exhaustion predicts later declines in job performance. So in summary, this isn't about ability or effort. It's about systems pushing people beyond their capacity for recovery. So if we already have these people in our workplace, why are we pushing them into burnout? So with all of this information available to me in my brain, I still assumed the problem was me. And I didn't question the systems. I just questioned myself. I believed that the emotional exhaustion that Taurus talked about was the product of trying to role play leadership. And I just had to try harder. And I did try harder. I even got a Master of Law. I have no undergraduate in law. I published a paper on authentic leadership to justify my own quirky and intense leadership style. And I would feel better for a second. I would. But it never lasted because it didn't matter how many accolades I collected. Same thing kept happening. I was just compensating. I had that recipe that facilitator had told me about, but I was just substituting the ingredients. So when people valued my polished delivery or my organization, I thought it was a compliment, but in reality, I was just being rewarded for performing leadership. And I think that potentially is the leadership lie, that belonging comes from performing convincingly enough to fit in. So when I first started seriously engaging with the topic of neurodiversity, something for me really clicked. Everything I had learned about leadership kind of had a default to it around leading, thinking, and communicating. And if you didn't meet that model, you were expected to adapt. Looking back, all of my leadership strengths were essentially survival strategies: pattern recognition, hyper preparation, scanning for risk, being amazing in a crisis situation or an emergency situation, but having a full-scale meltdown because my sleeve was wet. Useful skills, especially as a safety professional. But what I should have been asking was, why is leadership a performance? And if leadership isn't a performance, can we use leadership to create conditions where people can thrive and contribute safely? So this is where it came back to me. Like any self-respecting ADHD adult, who had just recognized a pattern in exclusion in leadership, a pattern in exclusion in safety. I went deep, and what I found was that leadership, traditional leadership, had not been defined in a neutral environment. Research by scholars like Alverson, Collinson, Eagley, all show us that traditional models of leadership came from patriarchal, military, and industrial systems, ones that valued authority, hierarchy, and control over difference or collective sense-making, essentially just conformity. In safety terms, we call this Safety One thinking, and Eric Knobel describes Safety One thinking as control and compliance. If something goes wrong in your organization, if there is an incident, it is someone's fault, and it is our job to fix them. Autism and ADHD have been treated like that for a very long time, and that is called the medical model. Sociologist Michael Oliver tells us that if someone struggles, the problem is assumed to sit inside them, that they are deficient. The environment doesn't change, they need to adapt. He then argues that many of the difficulties don't come from the person at all, but the mismatch between the person and the environment that was never created with them in mind in the first place. So this is kind of what that burnout piece looks like, right? When leadership relies on traits of conformity, people who process differently are framed as deficient. That deficiency, however, turns showing up as your authentic self into a risk, and that is a predictor of psychosocial harm. And this is why psychosocial harm is recognized in law in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as a foreseeable workplace risk, and why psychological safety is not just a legal duty, it is a cultural extra. It is something that is very important to our organizations. Psychosocial risk often goes unaddressed because the solutions seem really complex or hard to do. But in reality, most of them are free and easy to manage. Psychosocial harm starts reducing when we stop treating leadership as a performance and start treating it for what it is, authenticity. And then, and only then, can we shift away from traditional leadership. What makes a difference isn't awareness days or asking people to disclose. It's about creating safe, inclusive workplace design. Inclusion isn't about treating everyone the same. Inclusion isn't about special treatment. It's about creating conditions where different minds can thrive safely. I didn't have a good example of this sort of leadership when I started out in my career. So I had to become that example, not only for myself, but for my son. So many times I was told I wasn't leadership material, or that I was too quirky, or I was too loud, or I was too something. I was always something. So I ended up creating my own recipe for authentic leadership. And not everyone's going to like the taste. My son and other neurodivergent people are not a future workforce issue. We're already here in your teams, in your recruitment pipelines, in your leadership programs, in your organizations. I was sold a leadership lie. And once I stopped believing it, I realized that leadership is not a performance. It is the responsibility for creating an authentic environment for everyone to thrive. Kia ora.